So once again, we're looking at consumer goods on the y-axis and capital goods along the x-axis along the horizontal, capital goods, and consumer goods along the vertical. So again, we're looking at a production possibility frontier. So the center line, the solid line, is the one that we're referring to as our production possibility frontier. And what happens is that we're turning this around. So we're not just saying the production, what we're producing. We're also we're going to look at this in terms of consumption. And so what consumption means is that if what happens is that we as a country, well, we can use China for that. That would be a classic example. Is that China is a major exporter. So they export. They have an export-driven economy, as does Germany, and in the past, at any rate. Certainly not us. Not at this point, where our exports are higher than our imports. That is, our trade balance would be higher. So what happens we're just looking at, we'll just say this is China here. So China is producing along its production possibility frontier. We're just making that assumption that they're operating as efficiently as they possibly can. So but the point is that it's not just the production of those goods and services, it's also the consumption of those goods and services. So if China is actually exporting a good amount of the goods in particular we're talking about in this case, so if they're exporting a large portion of their goods, that means that their citizens, their residents in their country are unable to actually consume those goods. So that's why we're showing the line moving inward from the production possibility frontier, because in this case, the country produced them, yes, along the PPF or the production possibility curve, but they ended up exporting, so it reduced their ability to consume those goods and services. And again, as it notes here, exports exceed imports. So it shrinks, it brings in your consumption or investment possibilities curve. Now, looking at the U.S., the U.S. has, for the last 30 years, been running trade deficits, meaning, and we'll be getting into that again later in the course. Yes, we will be discussing that a bit later in the course. Yes, we will. We'll probably be covering that a bit later in the course. Anyways, the point is that the U.S. operating along its production possibility frontier, with the curve pushing outward, meaning consuming with imports exceeding exports, the consumers, the household as consumers, with the increased number of imports, are able to consume more than they otherwise would be able to do so. So if you get that straight in your head, is that by bringing in more goods, so there's an upside downside for trade, so for imports are depressing because they're not being produced in the country, but imports are also beneficial to consumers because it tends to keep prices down, competition up, and it also provides more goods that can be consumed for the household as consumers. Anyway, point being is that this is probably a decent depiction of what's going on in the U.S. Is that because we're able to import more than we export, and there are a variety of reasons why that has happened and why it continues to be the case, but because we're able to import more than we export, we're able to consume more than our production possibility, than what we have along our production possibility frontier. That can be beneficial. Say, for example, if we import a lot of computer goods and computers and so on and so forth, if we do that, that would actually allow us to help us push out the production possibility frontier. Point I'm making is I'm trying to illustrate that the imports, exports, there's a trade-off back and forth. There's some good, there's some bad, so on and so forth. But this is just a depiction of how things could look if again, how the U.S. is depicted as an import-driven nation where our trade balance is